comfortable because of the placement test. So there's really only one student outlier. And here are some of the quotations of the different students. So you can see students who said no, this is why they said no, why they said they were uncertain, which I thought the second student was very interesting. If tests are a way of learning, then I think it is important, but if it is just a way of checking understanding, I don't think it's important. So you can see here that maybe students are defining tests and assessment differently than instructors and institutions. So I thought that that was really important to take a look at. And again, we discussed the student outlier. For the instructors, in analyzing their responses, I found that instructor requirements depended upon instructor perception depended upon institutional requirements, their own personal views, and the nature of open enrollment. From there, that influenced how they measured student performance and the types of assessment that they gave. Here are some of the instructor quotes. So there was a mixed review. Some instructors didn't cite any problem with the institutional formal summative test or standardized test. Some instructors found that it was a little bit problematic. So you can kind of see some of their views here. And then this was my main findings. So my main findings, all three perceptions are different. Now, you probably could have guessed that that would have been the case, but as I'm trying to use this research to find some kind of concrete data, we had to go through this process. I can't just assume. And my second major finding was that the students have mixed views. Again, I kind of stated why that was important. So what does this mean? Well, my findings directly answered my research question. So that was good. I found out how students, instructors, and administrators are perceiving assessment. I found that there were different definitions. However, the population was so small that it's really difficult to make generalizations as to what exactly influenced each of these particular groups' perceptions. And so if this case study was done again, I would need to use a bigger population. Because I thought it would be interesting to see if educational backgrounds of the students or of the teachers actually influenced their perception. But because the scope was just too small, I didn't have anybody to compare it next to. So the important thing is that this actually raises awareness to the idea that these three groups are perceiving assessment differently. And my hope with this case study is that when people read this, the stakeholders in this group will be able to start a dialogue between the three different parties. So it's particularly instructors and institutions and instructors and students and how they are using assessment methods within this particular program. So my own reflection, this really impacted me because I'm still an instructor within open enrollment. And while I made a lot of efforts to change some of my assessment methodology, I learned that I still need to be clear with my students in how they are being assessed. If they're defining tests and assessment differently than I'm defining tests and assessment, then I need to figure that out, and I need to make sure that students know when they're being assessed and when they're not being assessed. The limitations I discussed briefly, mostly with the small scope, and some of them in the research or the design of the questions for the online questionnaires and the interview questions. For example, I probably could have left out some of the questions, and I could have been more intentional in directly asking how each group perceived testing or assessment. I didn't actually ask that direct question because I thought that by asking all these other questions, I would be able to find that answer. But if I had just asked that question, I probably would have gotten a more direct response. Connection to the field, as I said, there is nothing out there in this moment about assessment. If there is, it's very little. And so my hope is that this will just start a dialogue. And I did gather a lot of information, and so I'm interested in pursuing this, and hopefully others will be interested as well. And so these are some of the future studies based on my own data that I collected that I could probably look into. And in terms of personal growth, this whole research experience really taught me about my strengths and weaknesses as a person. There were times where I was very vulnerable, there were times where I was extremely confident in what I was doing, and so I think this was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And so knowing that I can get through this has really helped me to be able to be a better person and a better instructor. So that is it. That's my case studies. Yes.
This is very fascinating. I'm not familiar with open enrollment, so I mean, it's crazy. I commend you for teaching. I don't know if I would. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I mean, wow. so I'm just fascinated with the topic, and I'm glad actually that you did a case study because it was good. You know, and at the end you mentioned that you discovered that you will in the future make sure that your students understand what you mean by assessment. Because throughout your whole presentation I was thinking, wow, you know, they're talking about assessment and testing in general, their experiences with it, not necessarily the one that they are being given by your program. So that may have skewed the results because they were answering about testing in general and not the tests and assessments that you were giving. So did you find that a problem in collecting data?
Well, actually, the fact that they were all my own students, when I read over the data, I was actually, even though I didn't ask for their names, I knew who each one of them were when I answered it. And because I had taught them, I knew which tests they were talking about because they had specifically referenced particular situations. And so if I had been analyzing other student data, that probably would have been an issue. But because they were my own students, I was able to determine when they were talking about this particular program or if they were talking about another program. And if they were talking about another program, I just didn't use that data in my study.
I have a question about assessment, because assessment is such a broad term,
Right.
summative and formative. So when the students were answering these questions about the perceptions of assessment, were they thinking about assessment in the ways that an instructor might think about assessment, which is, I'm assessing, I mean, we're assessing students all the time. Just listening to what they're saying is an assessment. So were they able to see the difference between formal and informal, or summative versus?
I think that they were able to identify tests as separate, but what I found in my study is that a lot of students actually valued authentic practice instead of testing, but what they didn't realize was that when we assess them, authentic practice is included in how we are assessing students. So I guess that's what I was trying to say towards the end, is that we need to be clear as instructors in saying, we're actually doing everything you do in the classroom, every time you speak, every time you write, informal observations, we're using that to measure your growth. But I don't know that students know that we are. They value that, and they see that as important, but they just might not know that that's part of assessment. I found that they're kind of taking that as like practice is separate from assessment. And that could just be because they're not defining it, like you said, in the same way.
And do they feel that a formal test, if I only have 6 weeks, and if I'm testing every other day, I might feel like this is a waste of time. If I don't feel like it's pushed, so maybe I don't know.
That's something that I would like to look into further. It's just like I said, because the scope was so small, and because some of these students, they're no longer my students, they're back in their own countries, and it's kind of difficult to maintain contact. So if I could in the future, I'd like to revise my questionnaire questions to actually reflect that and try to figure out what's influencing their perceptions, how they're defining it, and see if I can get to the bottom of it.
We have about a minute, go ahead.
Did you ever consider the possibility of using different types of rubrics for the different activities you would use in your class to give them a taste of a different type of assessment and explain this is an assessment too, not just that fill in the bubble test?
I did actually give them different rubrics, because I started to experiment with project-based learning, and when I left that particular program, that was strictly what I did. So I started the week with a theme, carried out the theme, and at the end of the week was a project. And so they did have those specific rubrics, but I don't know that I did a really good job of explaining what the rubric was for. So they knew that they weren't taking a test, and that instead they were giving a presentation or doing a debate or having to just lead a student discussion, but they may not have known exactly that that was part of assessment. So that could have been a factor as well.
As continuing ed starts to move more towards managed enrollment, away from open enrollment, what part do you see assessment playing in that? And then, now that you're an expert in this, or becoming an expert, what role did you play in helping them make that transition? So
you said they're moving towards managed enrollment. I think in a managed enrollment, and from some of the research that I read, because I did research a little bit on managed enrollment programs too, and within a managed enrollment setting, the formal summative tests can possibly work because students are actually required to be there for a whole amount of time. So in that case, testing can work. But if students are viewing are valuing authentic practice, then instructors may need to alter the different methods that they're using to assess the students. So not strictly using the institution mandated tests, but also implementing their own. And I think that just comes with exposing instructors to different styles of assessment. And again, that could relate to their own educational background. So some of these instructors did go through master's programs, some of them didn't. Some of them just got a TESOL certificate, and some of them had never taught before. And so I think that that also plays a role in the type of assessment that they use in the classroom too. But I don't know, because I couldn't figure that out.
Thank you, Jaclyn. Could you please introduce to us your
Yes.
guest of honor here?
Oh, yeah, this is my mentor teacher, Dr. Nolte. So she actually helped me a lot throughout the semester. She teaches TESOL as well, so she teaches future teachers as well.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaclyn.